So now we're on slide 33. So the Opium War changed everything. It showed that foreign military power, that is European military power, with its modern navies, with its modern armies, were able to overcome the Qing military. It didn't mean, by the way, that the European powers could take huge chunks of Chinese territory and turn them into colonies like they were doing in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, there was less resistance than there was in China, and less resistance than there was in Japan. Japan was never taken over at all, partly because of the warrior culture that would have exacted a huge toll on any attempt to invade and occupy Japan, as as Burma had been invaded and occupied by the British, as Malaya was invaded and occupied, as Indonesia was gradually occupied by the Dutch, as Indochina was occupied by the French in the late 19th century. The resistance that the foreign powers encountered in China was of a medium sort. The foreign powers were hated and despised, not only by the Qing government, but by the Chinese people in general. There were always people who were willing to cooperate, of course, whenever there's money to be made or influence to be had. But for the most part, the foreign powers found that they could defeat the Qing, and they found that gradually they learned that it was a good thing to keep the Qing in power because the Qing would control the hatred and murderous impulses of many Chinese people toward foreigners, while they could not defeat the foreigners themselves. So what resulted, the dynamic that resulted, was that foreign powers competed with each other to establish not so much colonies, but spheres of influence. The British, for example, had a sphere of influence where they did not control everything, but where they were the dominant force all up and down the Yangtze River, or the Changjiang in Chinese, all up and down the Yangtze River, which is China's biggest river and most important waterway for navigation. Some of the powers stressed the opening of ports. Some of them merely wanted trade relations with regions. The Germans took over Qingdao, where the beer comes from. In Qingdao, in the 1950s and 60s, not only could you get good beer, you could get good chocolate. The only place in China where good chocolate could be had in huge chunks that were extremely cheap. A leftover of German influence. The British took over Hong Kong and expanded into Canton from there, so one of their spheres of influence was southern China. The German sphere of influence branched out from Qingdao into the rest of Shandong, and on and on and on. The only ones who didn't do much with this picture was Portugal. They were so small and so inconsequential that the Qing were able to tell them to take a flying leap when they tried to expand their power. And indeed, that's an interesting point, because whenever the Qing could resist, they did. They actually rebuffed the French in the 1880s, for example, not in central eastern China, where the French won a war with the Chinese, but in southern China, southwestern China, in Yunnan province. The French tried to invade Yunnan province from Vietnam, and the Qing fought them fiercely and chased them back into Vietnam. So it was a sort of a 2 steps backwards, 1 step forward sort of process with the Chinese. I'm being very general here, but they managed to hold off the foreigners in some spheres, and they had to give up in others. The big loss, however, came in 1900 when Peking was actually invaded by the foreigners. Actually, this happened twice. In 1860, during the Second Opium War, British-French expeditionary force invaded China, northern China, and took over Peking. And they did the same thing, a larger group of 8 nations in 1900, producing a series of unequal treaties with the Chinese, which are referred to as unequal treaties because they resulted in pretty much all give by China and all take by the foreign powers that were seeking to expand their influence and holdings in China. Let's go on to slide 34 and take a look at a couple of examples of these concessions that were set up. Now, since the foreign powers realized they did not have sufficient military force to take over huge chunks of China, they took over these small concessions instead, where they could establish a presence where people could have families, children could go to school, and so forth, and be under their own laws. And from there, they branched out to run business operations that gained them the profits that they were so desirable of. They established these notably in Shanghai and in Tianjin. Let's go on to slide 35, and you can see a map of Shanghai. It represents what happened in the last part of the 19th and early 20th century, where different powers, not too many really, gained influence in Shanghai and set up their own concessions with the agreement of the Chinese government, usually as a result of an unequal treaty following a war. Shanghai had not been much more than a fishing village before this era, and in the course of these foreign concessions being set up, Shanghai became a financial center for China. You've heard of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. It is a British institution. It's called HSBC because its main operations, when it was founded, were in Hong Kong and Shanghai. So there we are. Let's go on to slide 36. So here I've got I've sort of covered this already, but I've tried to make a bit of a summary of what concessions were versus colonies, and we've already talked about this, but it's interesting, there were some exceptions. There were 2 principal exceptions where foreign powers tried to take over large pieces of land. One was that the Russians actually did take over all of a province, Liaoning province in the northeast, in the late 19th century, which was a development that led to the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 and 05, because the Japanese were also expanding as well. And why were the Russians and the Japanese able to do this? It was because they were close by. They had territory that was bordering on China, and they were able to, the Japanese much more than the Russians, were able to bring in sufficient resources to actually take over large pieces of land during this feeding frenzy that occurred in the late 19th and into the early 20th century in China. but it was only Japan that was destined to take over huge chunks of China. They seriously overextended themselves during World War II, which we'll learn more about later. And I've already talked about France trying to invade southwest China and not succeeding. So again, China was not the same as Burma or Indochina. It was more resistant to colonization, but not quite as resistant as were the Japanese, who ended up being much more successful. Let's go on to slide 37. So thinking about this again in geopolitical terms, who's closest to China with the shortest logistical route? Who can most easily project power onto the Chinese mainland? Who wanted to settle large numbers of citizens in China? Why, it was Japan. They made their first attempts in China in the first big attempts, the War of 1894 to 95. And when they won that war, they were going to take over a large chunk of Liaoning and so forth. But Germany, France, and Russia had other ideas. You have to keep in mind that at this point, the other powers were already invested, so to speak, in China in a big way. And along comes Japan with its newly established military machine, seeking to take over large parts of that country, and of course that threatened the powers that be. So the triple intervention of 1895 by Germany, France, and Russia forced the Japanese to withdraw from their claims. They were able to keep some territory, but not nearly as much as they won on the battlefield against the Chinese. Let's go on to slide 38. So I want to back up a little bit now and talk about, I've been trying to take this sort of topic by topic rather than in a purely chronological way. I want to back up a little bit now and talk about the reason that Chinese authority gradually dissolved, Qing authority gradually dissolved. And that was that as they became weaker, as foreign powers took more and more advantage, it became evident to people that the power of the Qing was declining. And because the difficulties of governance of China had always included exploitation by officials against ordinary people. When Qing power began to decline, people didn't want to put up with that anymore. This is stating it very simply, but this is what was one of the causes of the Taiping Rebellion, which began in central China and expanded out from the periphery toward the eastern population centers of China. Therefore, it became a threat to Shanghai. The Taiping Rebellion was led by a man who was convinced that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. It was a semi-Christian, it had semi-Christian overtones, and it was a struggle that was intended to overthrow the Qing and establish rule that would be beneficial to ordinary people. It was also, of course, a very, like any struggle during this period, there was immense cruelty by the people who were engaged in it. But be that as it may, the historical forces that were at play here pitted ordinary people rising up against declining Qing authority in a way that threatened the foreign powers. And so what happened was that the principal foreign power in China, which was the British, decided to come to the assistance of the Qing, not by sending in troops, but by selling them weapons, and by opposing any advance of the Taiping. So, and they did this because they realized, again, that the Qing would put down internal rebellions, but they would acquiesce to foreign presence in China, and an odd partnership of sorts developed between the Qing and the occupying foreign powers against their own people. And that's a very simple way of stating the outcome of the Taiping Rebellion and other rebellions like it that occurred during the mid and late 19th century. It caused an awful lot of damage and an awful lot of grief. Meanwhile, let's go to slide 39. Meanwhile, in Japan, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to point out that the processes that came into place after the Japanese islands were forcibly opened up by the United States and Britain, that resulted in a revolution of sorts that established a new form of government that returned the emperor to the top place in society, not so much as the real ruler, but as the symbol of the nation under which everyone could unite. The Meiji Restoration resulted in Japan establishing firm boundaries, both internal and external, gaining full sovereignty over Hokkaido, the northernmost island that bordered on Russian interests, in reversing the unequal treaties that the Japanese were also subject to by Britain and America. By the end, it took decades, but they managed to reverse these treaties by negotiating with the foreign powers. And the reason they were able to do this was that they were in a position of power to actually do so by the end of the century. So in 1894, Japan was no longer subject to foreign unequal treaties as China continued to be. And then they ended up getting into a civil war, rather a war with China. And going on to slide 40, the key Japanese advantage here that the Chinese wanted to pursue and attain, but that they could not do, was successful industrialization. The accumulation of capital, the government sponsorship of large corporate interests who were called zaibatsu, the combination of industry, banking, and sales groups, all in one package, to become industrial groups that were highly effective at establishing importation and use of technology and implementation of advanced manufacturing, that resulted in Japan being able to produce modern weaponry, a modern navy. When it came up against the Chinese forces in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, blew them out of the water. Again, fire and maneuver, the name of the game. The Japanese were able to move quickly on the water. They were able to deliver live rounds of ammunition much faster. They had, in other words, faster firing guns, faster ships than did the Chinese, and the Chinese were simply no match. And this was a big surprise to practically everyone except the British, because the British by this time were allies with Japan. Let's go on to slide 41. And just preceding that development, that should have been a big warning to everybody, but was apparently not so, except again to the British, was Japan's forced opening of Korea. Korea being the closest tributary state to China. For many, many centuries, the Chinese had been dominant on the Korean peninsula, and the Japanese, as they became more able to project power, decided that they were not going to acquiesce to that situation any longer. So I don't want to go through this whole thing here because I'm really stealing this from a previous class that was on Asia in general. But the bottom line is that the Japanese were able to force the opening of Korea against the will of the Qing dynasty, and this eventually led to warfare between the two states. I'll stop here, and we'll have one more audio to finish up the lecture. I'll be continuing on slide 42.